And Rameshwar Das, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Well, this is really lovely to get together with all these folks that I know when I page through the names, and I might try and change the display so I can see everybody actually. Will that work? Yeah, look at that. Hi.
All right. So
it's fun.
I just found the books endlessly fascinating. Like all of the books that he wrote and that you co-wrote with him, you know, I can turn to any page and you just find these wonderful little pearls of wisdom. And it's so entertaining and informative and enlightening and all of these things at once. But do you want to talk about the man, or how you came to meet the man for the first time, and how you guys managed to be on this sort of parallel track, even though he was a little bit ahead of you in years?
He's definitely ahead of me, not just in years, but in his kind of spiritual adventures and development. And I think that his life has been pretty much of an inspiration for me and a lot of other people. And he always, as a teacher, has used his life experiences as he called it, grist for the mill. But I met Randos when I was in college at Wesleyan, and I used to commute over to East Hampton on the weekends across the New London Ferry. And I met him when he first came back from India, and he had done his master's degree in psychology with a wonderful guy named David McClelland at Wesleyan, who subsequently went to Harvard and hired Ramdas to teach psychology there after some years. But anyway, some of the students that he had taught at Wesleyan were now teaching psychology by the time I got there at Wesleyan. And they invited him to come speak, and I, along with a bunch of other people, was expecting the Better Living Through Modern Chemistry talk from the Leary and Alpert firm of intranauts. They occasionally called themselves the psychedelic explorers who had been working at Harvard together. And this is March in 1968, kind of, New England frozen mud. And this guy walks in barefoot with a long white beard, wearing sort of a white dress. And that was the initial shock. And it was a program in a lounge, kind of, so people spread out on couches and on the floor. And he started talking at 7 in the evening. And instead of psychedelics, he was talking about his journey to India and learning yoga and meditation, and what that had done to, how his consciousness had changed in that time. And he started speaking around 7:30 in the evening, and he spoke until 3 in the morning. And after a while, somebody turned out the lights, and there was just this voice in the darkness. A couple of years later, I got to India to see his guru myself, and it was the same feeling that I had had that evening. It was as though the guru, that place of, understanding, that inner place that had pulled me at that initial meeting, was clearly what had occurred that first evening. And I started going up to visit with him and learning yoga and meditation from him. And then it's been downhill from there.
I find it so hard to put it into words sometimes, but is there a way to put into words that feeling that you got from Ramdas and then from Maharaji?
Well, I remember when I used to come out to visit my grandparents, who were the original family that I had out here. And in high school, I would drive out here on the weekends, and there's a point where you get off the LIE wasn't even out here all the way at that point. And you'd get off the highway and the air changed. And when I would get closer to East Hampton, I just had this incredible feeling of kind of coming home. And that was what I felt. It was this just feeling of being home at this place that was really represented the deepest feeling of love in my life at that point. And it was that kind of amplified. And as soon as I went with two other friends from the States, a guy named, who's now called Krishna Das, who does chanting, and Danny Goleman, who is a psychologist and did his Harvard thesis on Buddhist psychology, and wrote quite a wonderful book called Emotional Intelligence. It's been done a lot of good for a lot of people. And we got to Maharaji, and I think we were all kind of blown away. And he immediately sent us to take food. That was kind of the first thing that happened. And I think we were so excited. I sat down, the food at the ashram, which is called prasad, which means blessed food. And it's a sort of a way of, sharing blessings. And they sat us down, and they were leaf plates made from leaves stuck together with little sticks. And there were piles of spicy potatoes and puris, which are deep fried flatbread in ghee or butter. And it's not lightweight food. And I ate 17 puris and 3 huge piles of potatoes. And I finally sort of got back into my body a bit, I think. And then we went to see Maharaji, and that was the beginning of a year and a half in India, until I got what's called a quit India notice, which you may be familiar with, Christopher, which means you better get out now or we're never letting you come back.
Well, I was only there for 6 weeks at a time. That was the most I'd ever spent there. So I think I was allowed to stay that long. It's so funny. I think back to the first time I was there. I was up in Ladakh, in the very, it was in the eastern part of Jammu and Kashmir state, up in the mountains there. And my soon-to-be wife and her father brought me to a high lama, and I was brought into a little room. And just before I went into the room, my wife-to-be whispers to me, "He knows everything about you." Everything? And Ramdas had, or rather Richard Alpert had the very same experience as he was in his initial meeting with Maharaji, which is fascinating. And I will never understand perhaps why India seems to be this spiritual hotspot in the world, but maybe we should reel me in a little bit and go back to the book. His life is such an interesting one, in that it just traces, I think I said something like the arc of the 20th century from about World War II to just a year or so ago. And we see so many characters of 20th century culture, like the Grateful Dead, isn't it? Charles Mingus, a bunch of musicians, Allen Ginsberg, and then a lot of his fellow travelers as well. Do you think he was uniquely positioned to have this encounter, and did his prior training as a psychologist, and then this encounter with Timothy Leary and all of the legitimate research they were doing with psychedelics, prepare him for that? Because it's not an everyday occurrence that somebody has this sort of career path, or rather spiritual path, or whatever it is.
Yeah, it's whatever it is. I think he was quite unique that way. I mean, it's almost as if he had three lifetimes packed into one, starting with psychology. And, he taught at Stanford, and then he taught at Harvard, and he was really apparently a great psychology teacher. I never knew him as in the Richard Alpert part of his incarnation. And then they got into the psychedelic work at Harvard. And that started, I think, the real depth of his search. And that was the time when I think he really began to understand that his identity was separate from his roles and his kind of family situation and his who he thought of himself as a psychologist. And he took a lot of psychedelic trips and guided trips for other people for a number of years, and kind of came to the end of that because there were problems with psychedelics, especially in that you come down. And that got to be, weighing more on him because it was such a, kind of a yo-yo path. And I think he was beginning to feel a certain amount of despair when he went to India. And that was, kind of the next thing. And he was looking for someone. There was, toward the end of the psychedelic work, he said he took an LSD trip that was completely ineffable, and he didn't know what it was about. And the next day, Aldous Huxley, who had been a supporter and mentor for them, turned up, and he brought the Tibetan Book of the Dead in translation. And that book for Ramdas at that time, and I think for the others who were involved in the psychedelic work, was kind of a real map for the states that they were traversing internally.
Right.
If for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, the Book of the Dead is a guidebook for people leaving their body and traversing planes of consciousness out of body. They're called bardos. And it's a way to, it's read to people after they die or while they're dying. And it is meant to help you get toward what is initially called the clear light, and to try to loosen your bonds to the wheel of birth and death at that juncture. And interestingly, there's a wonderful Buddhist scholar who was also involved in the psychedelic movement named Bob Thurman, who probably some of you know. And Bob says that this plane, where we are right now, is a bardo. It's an in-between. And if you want to think of that as we're in between form and formless. And that made real sense for Ramdas from the work that he'd been doing. So he went to India basically in search of somebody who could read those maps.
Right.
And I think we called it the map maker in the book.
Yeah. I love that part. That's such a wonderful part when he's talking about encountering the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and he and I think Leary suddenly realized, wait a minute, someone's been here before us.
Yeah.
But they did it without hallucinogenic drugs. How do you suppose they got there? And for that matter,
well, you know, it doesn't matter so much. Clearly those practices, when you read some of the those Tibetan masters or the Indian yogis, what they talk about and is very much a parallel of that view, that we are not just our physical body. Mm-hmm. And they're through meditation and other practices, the ones who have worked at it for a while do learn to dwell in just pure awareness, essentially, and without the attachments that drive most of us most of the time, without the being identified with our thoughts all the time, which is certainly where I live most of the time. And probably you do too.
Oh yeah, you must know everything about me. I think, like, prior to the Beat Poets, at least, and certainly Ramdas and folks like Jack Kornfield and so many of the other people who are sprinkled throughout the book, we in the West just didn't have any inkling about this, really. And the Western religions are quite a bit different. I mean, I know there are mystics in Western religions as well, but and you may have disproven something that I was going to say earlier. And also, before I forget, please read excerpts or show pictures anytime, just jump in. But where was I going with this? I found that in Ladakh, when I was studying meditation and yoga, and I don't mean studying deeply, I would go to a class one day while my wife and I were visiting her family for a month. I was rather surprised to find that the instructors were not little Indian guys in white robes, but Englishmen. And yet they seem to be able to impart these things to me perhaps better than had I, learned it. I read one of Maharishi's books about 10 years ago, and I read Discourses by Meher Baba, and I found them just so dense and esoteric, and I had such a hard time with them. And yet this, very spry young Englishman was teaching yoga to a bunch of us Westerners and Israelis and Lebanese and Europeans and such. And it just, everybody seemed to get it, and the same goes for the meditation. It was, and so I wondered if Ram Dass had this ability as a Westerner to bring this back and teach it to all of us. But you say you had the same feeling from Maharaji as you did from Ram Dass. So that's why I say you maybe disproved that. But certainly Ram Dass was one of the pioneers and one of the forerunners and one of the most important figures in bringing this wisdom to the West. And boy, I think, so many of our lives are a lot richer for that.
Well, that integration of especially his understanding of psychology in relation to the Eastern practice, I think made it easier for him to really formulate those teachings in ways that we could relate to in the West. And he was also, in his lectures, he was known for being a fairly entertaining talker. He kind of had the gift of gab, and I've never known anybody who could keep 3 storylines going in the air and have them all end up in the same place at the same time when he was talking. Yeah. But he could do that. Yeah. And he had a stroke in 1997 that almost took him out. Mm-hmm. And it really affected his speech. He had very almost complete aphasia for a while, which he lost his power of speech. And he went from being, I think Wavy Gravy called him the master of the one-liner to the master of the ocean liner. Mm-hmm. And his storytelling and speeches and lecturing really came to a real inflection point at that time. And so he was around for another 20 years, and that was pretty amazing. He was wheelchair bound. His body was paralyzed on one side almost completely, and he was really, over time, that took its toll. And his teaching changed, although he kept at it. And there's a friend of ours out here, Mickey Lemley, who has a place in Watermill. I don't know if he's with us today, but he did a film of Ramdas' recovery from that stroke called Fierce Grace, which is really remarkable to see what he did to recover. It was not easy. And I think it was Mickey that really encouraged him to start doing public speaking again. It took a lot to get up in front of people on a stage and have long pauses while he searched for the words that he wanted to say. And it was curious in the process of the book too, because he really, he often knew what he wanted to say, and he knew how he wanted to say it. And I had to help him do that. And that was kind of my job description, I think. And his speech was slow enough that I was basically taking dictation as we went along. And I'm not the fastest typist in the universe, as my wife can surely attest. And it took 10 years. So that was one reason the book took quite a while. But the other thing that happened in that period is that I think he came from being much more occupied with states of consciousness and how awareness functions, to what I would call a heart space, a real expression of love. And that to me, I think, was one of the really unique aspects of his manifestation in those years. And we started running retreats in Hawaii because he couldn't travel anymore. And there were some quite wonderful, especially Buddhist teachers like Jack Kornfield and Sharon Salzberg, and Joseph Goldstein came, Bob Thurman, a bunch of really erudite and masterful meditation and teachers of the real deep wisdom. And the other part of it, though, was Ramdas talking about what in the Hindu system is called bhakti, or it's the path of devotion or love. And then every evening, Krishna Das would lead chanting for about 3 hours. And it went back and forth from this sort of deep look into our psyches and into just letting go into kind of ecstatic chanting. And I think for the people that attended those retreats, certainly for me, it was that combination of bringing the wisdom of the intellect to bear and but just opening the heart, I think, is a really necessary combination that it doesn't always exist in a practice in either the East or the West. It was something that we got exposed to, and I think it was what Maharaji kind of laid on our plates when we were in India, and has transmitted through Ramdas and many other teachers too. I don't want to make this sound exclusive, because it isn't.
Right. I looked through the bookshelf the other little while ago, and I came across this one too, also co-written by Rameshwar Das, Be Love Now, as well as Polishing the Mirror. But we're talking
Yeah, I like that one.
Yeah, we're talking tonight about Being Ram Dass, the memoir. Would you like to read an excerpt from Being Ram Dass?
Sure. Okay, this is going to be kind of the random walk approach. So this is the moment when Ramdas meets Maharaji on his first trip to India, and which he spoke about and related endlessly. It's in his first book, which was called Be Here Now, as Ramdas. He wrote about psychology before that, but in doing this memoir, we really sort of went back and looked at some of those experiences again, in kind of different way. But he had this experience when he gets to Maharaji, and he does not want anything to do with a guru. He considers himself a Buddhist, and he is still, there's a lot of the uptight Harvard psychology professor judging Westerner in this.
He's also very uptight about a certain Land Rover at the moment, as it's been read.
Yeah, he traveled to India in a Land Rover, and then the guy who had provided the Land Rover, who was an entrepreneur named David Padwa, was a really wonderful guy, who's a real Buddhist practitioner now also. David left for Japan, and he left the Land Rover essentially in Ramdas' charge. So Ramdas is driving up to see the guru with this young surfer from Malibu who has become a disciple of this old man in a blanket. And he won't let Ramdas drive. And they're driving up into the Himalayas, and the roads are twisting all over the place. And this guy is hysterical with anticipation, and he's crying and laughing. And Ramdas is worried they're going to stay on the road, and he doesn't know what's going to happen to the Land Rover. He's uptight. After a brief rest, they bring us sweet chai tea. Maharaji calls for us. We climb back up to the terrace where he's sitting. He motions for me to sit in the grass in front of him. I feel more uneasy. What's going to happen? The translator sits down next to me. Maharaji looks at me. You were out under the stars last night, he says. Yeah, I was, I reply. Inside, I'm thinking, we're making conversation. Anybody could have been under the stars last night. You were thinking about your mother, he says. That shocks me. Where is this going? Yeah, I was, I reply. How does he know about my mother? I haven't mentioned anything about her to anyone, not even to Bhagwan Das. She died in the last year, continues Maharaji. Yes. She got very big in the stomach before she died. Yes, that's right. Spleen. She died of spleen. Up to this point, he's been speaking in Hindi, and the whole conversation has been through the translator. Now he looks directly at me and says, spleen, in plain English. I feel shock and confusion. How does an old man wrapped in a blanket in the Himalayas know intimate details about my mother? Mother was so embarrassed by her swollen belly. Suddenly, the spirit of my mother floods back over me. Inside, my rational mind, like a computer in overdrive, tries desperately to figure out how he knows all this. I start running through every possible paranoid scenario. How could he know about my mother? I didn't tell anyone about last night. He had had this vision of his mother out walking under the stars when he had to walk to an outhouse in the middle of the night. I didn't tell anyone. My mind keeps running in circles, getting nowhere. No matter how fantastic my storylines get, none of them make sense. My mind can't handle it. This is beyond my wildest fantasy. It's definitely not in the cognitive psychology textbook. If I were high on LSD, the observer in me would say, well, how do I know? I'm not just projecting and creating this out of whole cloth anyway. But right now, I'm not under any chemical influence, and I'm certainly not at Harvard. He just said spleen in plain English. How can he know that? My mind goes faster and faster, trying to figure out how Maharaji knows this. Finally, like a cartoon computer stuck in an insoluble loop, the bell rings, the red light flashes, my mind just stops. I'm stuck. My rational mind gives up. It just goes poof. At that same moment, there's a violent wrenching in my chest, a very painful pull, and I start to cry. Later, I realize it was my spiritual heart opening. How fitting that when he says spleen and my mind blows and my heart opens, the organ that killed my mother becomes the key for my awakening. I've been looking for someone who can show me more about planes of consciousness, but in the intensity of this opening, I forget all about maps or map makers. Concepts from my past are not even remotely relevant. After weeks of pilgrimage, being here now with blisters and bad food, I realize Maharaji is orchestrating my awakening. The people around him know what is happening. This is what a guru does. Well, goes on from there, but
it's just such a powerful account. I love that, and what an inflection point and what a transformational moment, not for him only, but for everybody who's come into contact with that since. With that
well,
account.
I think one of the really, it's kind of along the lines of that transition I was talking about with him, in that for years after that, he felt that it had been Maharaji's psychic powers that had opened him. And it took really a while and that kind of his own exploration to realize that it had been the quality of love that he later called unconditional love, that Maharaji's compassion toward him had, that love had really been what opened him up, and where he felt that his own evolution lay also. And this, those communicating both the philosophical and the psychological and that emotional component all together is not easy. And even the idea of a guru in the West is a tough concept, because I think we have these so many power relationships in our lives, and I think the way that we're brought up in the West probably leads more to authority figures, and there's these power relationships. Ramdas certainly had that with his family, and I guess I did with mine to some extent. One of the experiences that I had in India was meeting Indian families and feeling the kind of love that exists between multiple generations in extended families. And it's a bit different from what we we live with in our culture.
Right, right. And there's such devotion among so many people that I've come across there. It's really moving to see. Is it true that there's an audiobook of Being Ram Dass in the works?
Yeah, there's somebody on this Zoom, Cynthia Daniels, who has a great studio in Northwest, who recorded that audiobook with me. Great. And I didn't think it was going to come out at the same time as the print book, but it did. And it's up on Audible.
Oh, great.
I think you can actually buy a gigantic CD set as well if you are still on that stage of technology, which I am to some degree.
And why not? Did you have some pictures? Do you want to show?
Yeah, let's do a little. I can do about a 5-minute slideshow, and then let's do some questions if there are any. Let's see. I have to figure out the screen share again. Okay, this is a. Is this working yet? Here. Oh. Okay. People seeing that? Yeah. So that's Ram Dass' mother. A bunch of these are from his family, and they're great. And that was his Mercedes when he was at Harvard. And that is him with Tim Leary and Peggy Hitchcock. And this is also at that same time, they were down in the Caribbean running a psychedelic retreat. I'm going to, wait a second, I'm going to break out of this slideshow thing. Okay, because I can't talk fast enough. This is the house at Millbrook, which belonged to Peggy Hitchcock's brothers, and they allowed them to move here after Harvard, and they set up a psychedelic center, and which was kind of one of the early communes as well. And this was from a gathering in San Francisco. You can see Timothy Leary, Richard Alpert, Allen Ginsberg, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, a bunch of other people you probably recognize. And this was something called the Human Being, I think in about 1966 or 7. Let's see, there was a lot of fun stuff. And this was a bus that Ram Dass crossed a lot of the country in with a girlfriend of his at one point, and it's now parked at the Lama Foundation and is an occasional dwelling and summer retreat spot for people there. So that's in northern New Mexico. And this is the India trip with David Padwa. That's Ram Dass on the left and David on the right. And as you can see, I think they're up in the Khyber Pass at this point. And that is the young Bhagwan Das, the surfer yogi who brought Ram Dass to Maharaji. And that is Maharaji in the little ashram in the hills. And behind him is a devotee named Dada Mukherjee, who was an economics professor. And that's the room that Ram Dass lived in at Kenchi when he first went. That was his, where he learned yoga and meditation. And he stayed there through a winter in this unheated cement room. And meditated in the snow and took baths in the river. It was a fairly austere kind of life. And he was mostly on silence. That's the temple, and not in the winter. And this is some years later when they had built more onto it. But you can see that it's in the bottom of a little valley. It's about 7,000 feet in the Himalayas, which go up from there. And that's one of the good photos of Maharaji. You rarely saw his eyes. Very curious. Whoops, I want to go back to that one. That's fun. That was from soon after he came back. That was an experimental double exposure of mine. It's slightly off center, but what to do?
It's fantastic. Love that.
And when he came back, he gave a series of lectures in New York at a place called the Sculpture Studio, which is where this is. And he was, those lectures became those, when transcribed, were the basis of Be Here Now, which was the book that ended up in a lot of backpackers' luggage over the years. And that's our friend, K.K. Saw. This is near the temple in North India. And that is me on the right, believe it or not. And, you know, as you can see, there was a lot going on all the time, but that's Ramdas with Maharaji in 1971. And this is part of the Western crew that turned up there by, you know, who knew what circumstance. There were people from Canada and Colombia and all over the place, Australia in this group. And this was just one of those moments in time. And we've taken to calling this photo Nainital High.
Mm-hmm.
That's again with Ramdas Maharaji and Dada Mukherjee at Dada's house in Allahabad, where he was a professor. And he used to go out and teach. This is a woman named Siddhima, who was a housewife in the nearby town. And after she raised her family, she came and lived at the ashram and essentially took care of Maharaji. And she was so absorbed and devoted that I would say that she absorbed a lot of that state of being. And when he left his body in 1973, she ran the ashrams for the next 35 years, I guess, until she left her body. And that's Ramdas in the cabin in New Hampshire at his family's farm, where he set up what eventually became kind of a yoga camp. That's another one from India. And then he took teachings from a number of other teachers. This is Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who's a Lama who taught in the 70s and started a Naropa Institute in Boulder, Colorado, which is one of the only Buddhist, now a university, an accredited university in this country. And Ramdas taught there the first summer. Oh, this is that class. He taught a class in the Bhagavad Gita, and there were about 1,200 people that signed up. And it was great fun. The university was a warehouse in downtown Boulder that they had gutted and put industrial carpet on the floor and made it a lecture hall. This is a woman from Brooklyn who was called Joya, who went into some sort of a transcendental state in a Jack LaLanne yoga class, and became a teacher, including a teacher for Ramdas for a while. And she was somewhat irreverent. Then in the 80s, he got very involved in service. This is Larry Brilliant, who helped start the SEVA program, who I was speaking with in the other night through a place in California. And he started a group called the SEVA Foundation. And he's got it's a rather amazing story. He has a wonderful book out called Sometimes Brilliant. And he now is consulting for, on the pandemic. He runs a group called Pandemic Defense through Jeff Skoll, who started, I think, eBay.
Rameshwar, if I could interrupt just for a moment, because I have a question in the chat box that has,
okay.
Well, no, we have a question in the chat box that has to do with the pandemic, so I figured I'd jump in now. It looks like Alex from Cologne, so wow, we have someone from far away, is asking, what advice or help do you think Randos would offer in regard to the current pandemic?
Well, I guess that is good timing. It's curious because he died just before the pandemic really began to take hold. But I have been thinking about that, and I think that the practices that he gave people to center and calm ourselves and through meditation and yoga and things like chanting and mantra, which also translates into prayer and, our more Western approach. I think they really can help us not overcome the pandemic, but deal with the anxiety and the panic and the existential chaos that is around us as a result. And then there is the service part of it, which has clearly become such an incredible ethic, especially, of people who are putting themselves on the line to help out. And in that Bhagavad Gita course that you saw, for instance, he really worked at introducing the idea in the Gita of what's called karma yoga, which is essentially doing whatever you can to help, to serve, and not being attached, not worrying about how it's going to turn out. So it's kind of surrendering at the same time you are doing your utmost to be of use or help.
So glad you said that, because I didn't want to let this go by without us mentioning that Maharaji, I think, imparted above all that, I'm misusing the word mantra maybe here, but above all, serve all, remember God, I think was the message.
Yeah, I mean, he, the temples that he built, those little ashrams, and there were quite a number of them, not just the one that you saw, were around a Hindu deity named Hanuman, who's a monkey god and a figure in the Ramayana. And he is part monkey and part human and part divine being. And he embodies this idea of service and devotion. The actual names that Maharaji passed around, the dasses, Das means servant. So Ram Das is the servant of Ram, which is the form of God in the Ramayana, which is this incredible epic. And that was something that he really started to work on. And at one point when he was first in India, Maharaji said to him, "You know Gandhi?" And Ramdas said, "Well, I know of him." And Maharaji said, "Be like Gandhi." And there was, Ramdas at some point came across a story about Gandhi, who was, he was getting on a train to go wherever he was going next. And this reporter hollered at him through the train window, "Give me a message for your people." And Gandhi scrawls on a piece of paper and hands it through the train window as the train's pulling out. And the message says, "My life is my message." And I think that was kind of where Ramdas, really tried to live up to that. And often I think he felt like his service, he worked, on bigger issues, everything from anti-nuclear to this Seva Foundation, which was a project to eliminate needless blindness in some of the third world countries, especially. They started in Nepal, which was tough going, and India. But he also realized he had to be engaged, and at the same time, he saw how angry some of the social action people were sometimes. It was like, peace now, peace now. We've all experienced that. And yet there is, he worked at trying to bring a more loving point of view to bear on that, and to realize that there isn't always just another side. It's not always as I guess they call it in politics, a zero-sum game.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, he's
certainly. And the other Maharaji's other teaching, which is the one that I think we all have been trying to understand and absorb and become over years, and it's very simple teaching. In Hindi, it was sub-ek, and that just means all one. Right. It was like, don't you get it? It's all one. And we didn't get it. It's still taking a while.
But we are stardust, and as George Harrison said, the time will come when you'll see we're all one, and life flows on within you and without you. We're almost at 6 o'clock already. If there are any questions, I think now is the time.
Yeah, we have it looks like it's 5:56. So if you want to add more questions in the chat box, I can read them to either Christopher or Rameshwar. Otherwise, we'll start to wrap it up.
Good. No more questions.
Buy the book, because it will have and answers, I think.
We can keep going a little longer. I don't mind, unless Allison needs to pull the plug on us. I think that in terms of why I'm happy this book is kind of out there now, and it has a life of its own, certainly, as books do. And it feels as though it's a good time for Ramdas' explorations to be kind of a parable for, what we need at this time, and this time of, real suffering and chaos that is around us.
I do have a couple questions. Gerard wants to know if you had any interaction with Nick Sand.
I didn't directly. I know who he is, Mr. Orange Sunshine, I believe. Is that correct?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Yeah, he was someone that Ramdas knew. I didn't know him directly, but I think Nicky Sand was one of the Orange Sunshine folks who helped to spread psychedelics around in the culture in the 70s and 60s and 70s.
I do have another question. Sharon Schalsberg recently mentioned She recently mentioned a scattering of consciousness. Has Ramesh experienced this, especially in terms of Ram Dass's consciousness in the year since his passing?
Well, I'm not very adaptable to. I don't experience, you know, what you would call astral stuff much. I mean, of like dreams and visions and other planes of consciousness. I seem to be a sort of earthbound type. But clearly, many people have had dreams and kind of transmissions from Ramdas. And you know, he worked a lot with dying people. And that was one of the places that he really spent a lot of time trying to, he helped change the culture around death. He worked with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross for years, who really started the hospice movement. And that work with the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the, you know, understanding of bardos. There's a part of the book, sort of near the end, where we took a kind of flight of fancy of what it's like, not just after death, but before birth. So, you know, I think most of us, most of the time, have this sense of our lives as like bookended by birth and death. But there are many people who've experienced near-death experiences. And there are people who are much more psychically disposed than I am, who can feel that souls continue. And I think the part that is most clear to me as a kind of earthbound, literal type is that the affection between people, that love, doesn't die. And I don't know how to express that in metaphysical terms or neuroscience or any of that, but that is my direct experience.
It looks like Greg is mentioning that he remembers listening to Ram Dass on WBAI back in the 70s, often on Bob Foss and Larry Josephson shows. Maybe this is more of a question for the whole of the group, but does anybody know if the shows were recorded and available? I'm not quite sure. I don't know if maybe you guys know.
Yeah, I know. But there was a whole series that he did with a guy named Paul Gorman at WBAI that was became a at the time a 6-record vinyl record box called Love, Serve, Remember, and it was made up at a commune in upstate New York, and called ZBS Media, and you can still get it as a download now, called Love, Serve, Remember. And it was, there's some wonderful pieces of it, including a reading that Ram Dass did of the third Chinese patriarch of Zen, which is revelatory. And there's, I think, the first recording of the Hanuman Chalisa, which is 40 verses in praise of Hanuman in Hindi, which, believe it or not, a whole lot of people have learned in America now. And we, on New Year's Day, usually there's been an assembly in New York City, and we do it all day for 108 times or something like that. And it takes pretty much, you know, like 12 hours. And at the end of doing that, you know it. So I can recommend that. And I see that, I don't know if she's still on here, but
Thank you.
Laurie Anderson was on here for a moment. And she did some recording up there also at ZBS with a wonderful engineer character who was pretty much of a magician named Bobby Bilecki. And he was the engineer on that album also.
The chat, it looks like people are kind of answering some of the questions as far as where to find those recordings, right? Ramdos.org. Somebody asked about Jack Kornfield. He was a friend of Bill's in high school, somebody who's in our group now. And Cynthia answered and said he's alive and well and providing great solace and wisdom. I guess you can check him out at jackkornfield.com.
And Spirit Rock. He runs a wonderful meditation center in Marin called Spirit Rock.
Right. Otherwise, that I think it looks like we touched on everything that I can see in the chat. Some people going back and forth. If they want to buy the book, absolutely check out Bookhampton. We love Bookhampton. Works with the library all the time. And as you were mentioning, the audiobook is coming out soon too.
It is out.
It is out.
All 18 hours of it.
So I want to thank you and Christopher so much and everybody for joining us. It was really great. We're always happy to have these kinds of events, and it sounds like we had people from all over joining us. So very exciting.
Yeah, thanks, Rameshwar. Thank you.
No, thank you all for hanging out. This is kind of a delight.
We could talk about this stuff all night. I think you were touching on things like duality, maybe without using the word, but duality, ego, and you know, there's just so much you can uncover, and through teachings from Ramdas and Jack Kornfield. Here's a book he edited, another one I just found. It's good, but I've found that, you know, we can live so much more purposeful and tranquil and meaningful lives as a consequence of knowing some of this stuff that I didn't learn in church, for example. So I'm grateful that Ram Dass was here and I was around at the same time, and that I managed indirectly to get some of the teachings through his books and through knowing you, Ramesh. So thank you.
Thank you all.